On the phone. It's a pleasure to welcome back to the program. It's been far too long. Robert McChesney, he's a professor at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and he is also the founder, or the co-founder, I should say, of Free Press, author of many books. Welcome to the program, Robert.
Hey, Sam. It's my pleasure to be here.
So now you've got basically two books out now, The Digital Disconnect, How Capitalism is Turning the Internet Against Democracy, and one that you've co-written with John Nichols, Dollarocracy, How the Money and Media Election Complex is Destroying America. I imagine you knew that both the books were coming out, but I want to talk a lot about the digital disconnect, but what is there a theme that's shared in these two books?
Well, yeah, there is, and I think it's that, America is in a deep crisis, that all those listeners, people familiar with American politics, I think know about, especially progressives, that, wealth is concentrated in the few, our political system has stopped working, effectively we're not a democracy anymore, the rule of money has taken over, and in digital disconnect, the point simply is that our technology won't do the job for us. The idea that the internet was going to be a revolutionary agent that would solve our political and social problems, unfortunately, hasn't proven to be true. It's been incorporated to a large extent within the system. What both books share, though, Sam, is that I think that I'm optimistic that these are very solvable problems. That they say it always looks darkest right before dawn, and I think it's very easy to look at where American society is and say, gosh, it's hopeless, it's depressing, it can't be fixed. The powers that are benefit are far too strong, and the powers that oppose, those forces that oppose, are far too weak. And I would say the better way to understand our situation today is that for the first time in my lifetime, a majority of the American people, and this is the proper show for to be on, the Majority Report, are pretty progressive. And that actually the moneyed interests are now desperate. They have to rig it so they can buy elections, thanks to Citizens United. They have to rig it so they can suppress the vote because they know they can't win a fair election. We've got the numbers on our side, and I think both books are fused really with an optimism. We want an honest appraisal of where things are at in our country, but we have to understand that we absolutely can win this fight. The other side knows it. We ought to know it too.
Well, I'm glad. It's nice to hear a hopeful refrain. But let's talk about the digital disconnect. Because one of the things that we do on this program is talk a lot to libertarians who call in. And the internet is always cited, and certainly we see this coming out of Silicon Valley, as the great democratizer, as the solution to many of our problems. What is, in fact, the digital disconnect, and how does that? What's the interplay with what you call the really existing capitalism?
Well, I think the problem with almost all the analysis of the internet, from the very hopeful side that it's a democratizing agent to the really interesting books that are quite critical of it as an antisocial agent, but both those perspectives really underplay and underestimate the importance of capitalism, of the profit motive, of the way our economy works. And I argue in the book that capitalism has affected the internet far more than the internet has affected capitalism and capitalist society. And what I try to do in the book is show how the internet has been integrated into capitalism, and that the long-standing tension between capitalism and democracy, which is a historical tension going back to the beginning of the merger of capitalism and democracy, or the marriage of capitalism and democracy, that the internet has not solved that problem. And I think that was the great hope, that it would sort of iron out the rough edges. And if I can just take a second, please. The core problems that capitalism has for democracy is that capitalism tends to promote economic inequality, which is antithetical to a functional political democracy based on political equality. And also capitalism tends to promote monopoly power. And democracy doesn't work if the economy is in the hands of a very small number of powerful interests, because they will invariably have disproportionate control over the governance. And the question for the internet, then, is in the last 20 years, has it reduced inequality dramatically, and has it reduced monopoly power dramatically? And I think the evidence is in, the hard, cold facts are in. In the case of inequality, no. Inequality is much worse today than it was 20 years ago, and it was hardly good 20 years ago. And monopoly power is much greater today than it was 20 years ago, and it was hardly good 20 years ago. In fact, the internet, I think you could argue, might be the greatest creator of monopoly in the history of capitalism or of any economy. Everywhere it turns, it creates Googles, Microsofts, Apples, Amazons, eBays, all companies that have monopoly power equal to or greater than what John D. Rockefeller had with Standard Oil in the 19th century.
I mean, let's talk about that because I mean, I think you're right. And what is it about the internet that made it so susceptible to that type of monopoly takeover?
It's primarily what economists call network effects, meaning that the leader in a particular area has such great advantages that all people in the market have incentive to go to the number one company, and none of the other companies can survive. So if you want to use a social network, you can go to Facebook, and there are a billion other people who will be there with you, or you can go to some other service that will have 10 other people. Well, if you want to be in a social media, obviously you want to go to the largest one. None of the others survive. Google search, same thing. Software, same thing. You want to buy books or buy stuff online, Amazon has tremendous advantages of scale, traditional economic advantages that become much greater online. One of the ironies of the internet has been that by eliminating the importance of place, it's really eliminated all the small and mid-level locally based enterprises, the small bookstore, the small newspaper. None of them can survive. Only the giants survive. And no one had really anticipated this, but now we can see that's what's going on. And it leaves these companies, Sam, again, and this is where the democracy part comes in, it leaves these gigantic companies. 12 of the 30 largest companies in America today are internet monopolies. 12 of the 30. Right. It leaves these companies with inordinate political power. They basically own both political parties, and that really puts handcuffs on electoral democracy.
What is the alternative universe? I mean, how could that have developed differently? And what would you say to someone who says, well, I mean, why would you want to go on any social networking site if it wasn't a monopoly or it didn't sort of end up being one? You know, I mean, you want to be on a social networking site, I guess, where everybody is, presumably. And so what's the value of a social networking site that is somehow restricted in some fashion from becoming a monopoly?
That's precisely the right question, precisely the discussion we've got to be having. Now, ironically, Milton Friedman's mentor at the University of Chicago, an economist named Simons, who was a free market economist, his argument was that when you have private network monopolies, like the ones we've just been describing in a capitalist economy, that what it's crucial that they be taken over and nationalized and be made publicly run. If you have a natural monopoly, you cannot allow it to remain in private hands. If it can't be broken up successfully into smaller parts, then you have to make it a public monopoly. That was his argument. And that's actually a free market argument that says free markets can't survive if you have these giant monopolies. So that's one way to look at it. That's one approach, and that's ironically, as I said, not a socialist argument as much as it's also a free market argument. Regulation comes into play too. For example, online, the way these companies make money is by what we now have come to learn is extraordinarily spying on everything we do online. I mean, if you get something for free on the internet, you're not the customer, you're the product. And right. The way Google and Microsoft and Yahoo and these companies, Facebook, make money is they basically know everything we do online, know everything about us. They package that material, and then they use it to sell us stuff and to manipulate us. And we have very little privacy protection, as we've learned. I think if we put in strict privacy protection, then there would be less of a concern. When we have almost no privacy protection, combined with the political power these companies have, you end up with a situation like we have with the NSA scandal, which basically means huge private unaccountable power merging with government police power and being entirely unaccountable to anyone.
And was there things during the growth of the internet, because it's stunning to me on some level just how quickly this has turned. 10 years ago there was still this sort of notion of that the internet was going to sort of democratize everything and sort of levels the playing field in some fashion. And it really seems that somehow in the past maybe 5 years even, that has radically shifted. What could have been done? I mean, you talk about one theory is that as monopolies arise, within the context of the internet and the marketplace there, that it becomes necessary for government in some way to run that monopoly. Otherwise, it doesn't. It becomes it sort of inhibits the free market, I guess. But what were there policies that led to this, or that could have prevented it in some fashion, that we missed the boat on?
Well, I think you're right that it's really crystallized in the last 5 or 6 years, and that's why I wrote the book when I did. I couldn't have written it until then. Now it's become clear where the huge money can be made, and the dominant institutions are locked in place, and they're not going anywhere, if economic history teaches us anything, for another several generations, if not a century. So that's why it's the right moment for me to write that book, Digital Disconnect. And I think the other point that is crucial to the book that we haven't mentioned yet is that one of the great promises of the internet in terms of democracy was that it was going to give everyone access to all this information so they could participate. So it would lower the cost of information, and people would be able to learn stuff that in the olden days only really wealthy people or rulers would have access to. And one of the great paradoxes or ironies of the internet is that it is contributing to the disintegration and freefall collapse of journalism as we know it in the United States. The resources going to journalism have simply disappeared in the last generation. We're well under half of the resources per capita for journalism today than we had 2 decades ago, and it's falling sharply. Basically, the commercial interests have determined they can't make money doing journalism, so they stop doing it, and it's an absolute existential crisis for our society. The internet didn't entirely create the problem, but it greatly accelerated it. And it's pretty much eliminated the role of advertising as the primary economic support for commercial journalism by the new emergence of the sort of smart advertiser, where you no longer support a medium with your digital advertising. You just buy the ultimate customer on whatever website they go to, which is the dominant pattern now. And as a result, the internet, instead of giving us this wealth of information that everyone can get access to freely, is not producing that much information of great value with paid reporters, fact checkers, copy editors. All sorts of stories just don't get covered anymore. And that is, as I argue in the book, and this applies in both books, is a central political problem that we've got to solve in the United States, or pretty much all their issues are going to collapse. We'll have no hope of solving them.
Yeah, that problem seems incredibly vexing. I mean, we just, even in the past days where Nate Silver has gone from the New York Times, is going to head to ESPN. There's obviously far more resources at a Disney-owned company than even the New York Times there. And I want to tease out, because I want to examine this a little bit more, because I think this is one of those things where I just don't see how this works out in some way. And I say this as someone who obviously is sort of a small media entrepreneur, I guess. But the ad model it's fascinating what's happened just in the past couple of years, in that essentially it's become more efficient in some way for the advertisers. They no longer, when you describe they don't support a medium anymore, they no longer support these outfits where their yield is less than close to 100%. Can you just tease that out for people?
Well, you've really hit the nail on the head. It's such an important point. Advertising provided between 50 and 100% of the revenues of all news media from the late 19th century until now. And final readers, customers have never provided sufficient funds to support a popular journalism. Advertising was crucial to having anything close to a popular non-elite journalism. And advertisers didn't do that because they loved journalism. They did it because it was a smart business play. It was the best way to reach the audiences they wanted to reach through newspapers or broadcasting or magazines. But now they've learned, now they found they can reach those final consumers without having to pay the surplus, the premium over what they needed to pay to reach the consumer that supported media. They can do this smart advertising where now if a company General Motors wants to reach car buyers, it doesn't have to buy big ads in Sports Illustrated or on the Sunday news shows. It can simply go to Yahoo or Microsoft or Google or Facebook and say, we want to reach 5 million men, 18 to 29, who are going to be in the market for a new car in the next 6 months. And they have enough data that they will find those 5 million men, send out an ad almost immediately to whatever website those 5 million men go to. It doesn't matter what website it is. And the actual website barely gets any money at all, therefore. The money goes to the network. And this means there's no money for journalism as we understand it as we go digital. And that's the process that's going on. Now, the real important thing here, why we shouldn't get depressed and say, oh, my God, this is horrible, is that America had a brilliant journalism for the first century of its history, the envy of the world, 10 times the newspapers per capita of England or Canada or comparable countries, before there was advertising. So how did we do that? Well, we did it because we had massive postal and printing subsidies put in place by the federal government to spawn a diverse print media. And we have to think, and they understood exactly what they were doing in American history. They knew they couldn't have a democracy unless they did that. They wouldn't have a press, a journalism for the mass of the people. There would have been no abolitionist press without the postal subsidy. Not a single paper would have survived. It needed that postal subsidy. And I think we've got to think in those terms today. And this is how other democracies think. If you look at the leading democracies in the world by any standard, including The Economist magazine, they all have massive investments in public media and journalism, an order of magnitude 50 to 100 times greater than what we spend in the United States per capita. We've got to think in those terms, too, or we're going to have journalism, because the market has voted. The market says, hey, there's not money in this, and the smartest hedge fund managers in America are jumping ship. And if they're jumping ship, you can expect that everyone else is getting off right after them.
Because that is the where the rubber meets the road in terms of this conflict. That it's obviously good business practices for these companies to advertise to a group of people they know who meet the profile. 1 out of 9 out of every 99 out of every 100 times, versus trying to get a yield of 35 people for every 100 that they reach with their message. So, and one of the things I know that you discuss in your book is this idea of how to subsidize that via, and it escapes me now what the idea was called, and I think it was developed by Baker. But what is this notion of subsidizing via our tax dollars, or directing the tax dollars on an IRS form?
Yeah, I mean, the crucial thing is that democracies, we need public subsidies and investments to have journalism, but we don't want to allow the government to control the nature of the news. I think that is the democratic problem. And I think all Americans, to their great credit, are really concerned about letting the government have any control over the nature of news. And if we look at the NSA scandal, and it's an absolute nightmare, the idea that there would be these secretive people controlling who's doing the news and who isn't. But, as we've learned through our higher education system, as other democracies have shown us, you can set up structures that have public investments or subsidies and not have dominant politicians controlling the type of news. And in fact, the great irony is the research shows that in Northern Europe, in the most advanced democracies, the greater the public spending is to support journalism, the more adversarial the press gets, the more it feels like it's got the strength to stand up to the government. And I think these are solvable problems. I think that we just look around to our own past, we look to other countries, and the method you mentioned, Sam, is one that the great economist Dean Baker, who I suspect you've had on the show, he's done so much wonderful work on exposing the financial crisis, on the scam to try to get rid of Social Security. And Dean, with his brother Randy, in the last decade, have come up with an idea that every American should be able to devote $100 or $150 in a tax credit to any nonprofit medium of their choice. So it would be a public subsidy, but the government would play no role in it. The only catch is that the medium would have to be nonprofit. It couldn't accept advertising. And anything it did would not be protected by copyright. So, you wouldn't be setting up private monopolies. It would go instantly in the public domain, so anyone could use it at no charge. And I think it's a brilliant idea. And I don't know how much time we have, but when we first wrote about this, I first wrote about it with John Nichols 3 years ago. We went to Washington, D.C., and we visited both the Federal Trade Commission and the Federal Communications Commission, and each of them at that time had set up high-level panels to study the crisis in journalism and try to figure out how to solve it. And the people on both those panels said to me, as I walked in the door, they'd read our writing on it, said, this is obviously the solution. This is the way a rational society would solve this problem. But they said, but politically we can't do that in this country today. If we tried to even propose this, we would be destroyed. And I think that's a sad statement about where we're at, and it shows what our work is in front of us. Yeah,
I was going to say. I mean, it sounds like a brilliant idea. These news vouchers. One whose time I don't see how it could come. When we look at just sort of the hostility of our government, supporting the arts, while this is sort of very simple and transparent, I can see how it would be. The idea would just be demonized in some fashion.
This Sam gets to the point we raised in both books, but especially John and I talk about in Dollarocracy. While in theory everyone benefits by having a rich, vibrant, robust journalism, the democracy is much healthier, it helps the economy, it makes people happier, there's only good things happen from having robust journalism. There's actually one group in society that is penalized by having a robust journalism. There's one group of society that much prefers the status quo. And those are basically the people who own the society, right. The oil companies, the banks. That there's not very much investigative work done on their shenanigans in relation to the government is absolutely fine by them. And so the powerful are not enthusiastic about journalism. They never have been. They certainly aren't now. And they are the ones ultimately who oppose this.
And I want to just turn also to just compare where we are in terms of like the delivery mechanism of the internet and mobile technology and net neutrality, particularly relative to the rest of the world, because in some respects, what we see in terms of content online and the monopolies that are created there, it's the same dynamic that happens in terms of delivery.
I write about this a lot in Digital Disconnect, and Susan Crawford's written about it beautifully in her recent book. This is one of the great scandals of modern-day America, because what's happened is, the internet access in the United States is basically controlled by a cartel. There's really no other word for it. AT&T, Verizon, and Comcast have pretty much divided up internet access between cell phones, between landline broadband. You're going through one of those three companies or two or three others that have sort of the outlying rest of the market, and they don't compete. You really don't have much of a competition, nothing remotely close to competition. I'll give a funny story. My oldest daughter was going out to get, she moved to L.A. and was getting a cell phone. She went into the Verizon store, and the Verizon sales rep said, look, basically AT&T, we have for the exact same product at the exact same price as AT&T. We don't compete with them. It was just blunt, so don't waste your time even trying to get a better deal from anyone. And as a result, Americans pay for their cell phones and for their wire broadband access much more than people pay anywhere else in the world, and they get a much crappier service anywhere else in the industrial world. It's just absolute scandal. It's pure corruption. There's nothing here that justifies this economically. These companies have extraordinarily a great deal of power over the government, so they get their way. And it is a true crisis. I think it's going to become one of the great political organizing issues as people see more and more of their paychecks swallowed up by these companies and the crappy service they're getting. As they talk to friends from Canada or Europe who are saying, what the hell are you paying all this money for this garbage? I think it's a scandal, and it's one we are going to see become a front-burner political issue from the grassroots, because, frankly, at the top level, both parties in Washington are owned outright by the cartel.
And so what is I mean, do we have a sense of what what's the, I play this, game with my daughter about, pulling sticks out of a tower, and which is the one that is there one that we will pull that will begin to sort of start this cascade? I mean, I can see the value of having independently or independently funded journalism that begins to start to address these concerns and make people aware of them. I mean, what is there a linchpin, or what are the linchpins?
That's a strategic and tactical question, and I wish I knew those sort of answers. I'd be a lot smarter than I am. And it's also, we're looking at the future, and it's so impossible to ever predict the future. We just look at what's happened in the last few years, and so much no one anticipated. But I do think that what we do know for sure is that our society has a lot of real tensions and a lot of real problems that are not sustainable for a long time. The sort of corruption we have in America today. Sam, in the book I talk about two major studies that political scientists have done in the last 3 years that were published by Princeton University Press, independent studies, and they both concluded the same thing, which is working class, middle class people in this country have absolutely no control over the government or government policies. Policies that can only be understood as being controlled by the very wealthy. And, that sort of situation cannot go on forever because it produces all sorts of crises: infrastructure collapsing, public schools deteriorating, the economy stagnant, cynicism growing. Eventually, that is not sustainable. And I think we're in that process now where we're reaching completely unsustainable. And how that's going to play out, I don't know. What we try to argue in the book is that it's imperative in dollarocracy, that it's imperative that we try to make that what happens as humane and as progressive as possible, because bad things could happen too. And our mission is to try to get informed so we can have good things happen. One of the things that John Nichols and I are very enthusiastic about is this tremendous grassroots movement to have constitutional amendments to take corporations out of politics, take the money out of politics, to guarantee the right to vote so these state legislatures that are run by Republicans can't suppress the vote in a transparent and shameless and obscene manner. And this movement has won scores of elections all over the country in every possible district. They've never lost. They've had hundreds of referenda at this point. We've got several states that have signed up. And this doesn't get any coverage, but it's extraordinarily exciting to see the momentum, enthusiasm. People are hungry for real solutions to real problems, not BS solutions to real problems.
And of course the sort of the paradox of all this is that you cite the I think it was the Bartels and Martin Gillen's study from Princeton, and 8 years ago, 10, 12 years ago, or maybe before dial-up even, I certainly would not know what you were talking about. I mean, not someone who is in academia and without access to the internet, and these things get amplified. The idea that, there is some literacy amongst the public now, that, Reinhardt and Rogoff study, which was the one that supposedly promoted austerity, was sort of debunked. I mean, the irony is, of course, that the solution to the problem of the internet could very well be also the internet.
That's right, and that's the point in digital disconnect. There's nothing in that book that's critical of technology in the sense that per se. Rather, it's just that we need technology deployed to its most progressive and democratic uses, and not simply to try to spy on people so they can sell them junk, or whatever, to manipulate them and control them. And the technologies can be put to wonderful use, and they need to be put to wonderful use.
Absolutely. Well, Robert McChesney, thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate it. Is there anything else you think we should know?
No, just thank you for having me on the air, and I hopefully listeners will check out the books and engage with them, and I'd love to hear from people if they do read the books.
Great. Well, we're going to put a link to both the books on our site at majority.fm. Robert McChesney, thanks again for your time today.